From the SOC today, I'm joined by Alan Reichner, Detection Platform Architect, and Josh Servian, Detection Platform Manager here at Deepwatch. Alan and Josh have just presented at Splunk.conf and are joining me today to talk about what they presented. So gentlemen, thank you for joining me from the SOC today to talk a little bit about Splunk and ways Deepwatch uses Splunk.
Thanks, Bill.
Here. All right. To get started, I know that you two presented on some interesting capabilities. I know Splunk it's a powerhouse of data analysis that people have been using for over a decade now, if I'm reading my watch right. Often overlooked within the Splunk toolkit, though, is a very powerful visualization solution called Splunk UI, I believe, that most users never interact with. Josh, let me start with you. Why is this a tool that people often overlook?
Sure. It's, like as we shared, there's obviously some benefits that you get depending on the different methods that you use to create your dashboards, but Splunk UI, like the Splunk UI toolkit, is not necessarily for beginners or people first coming into Splunk and getting used to the SIM platform in general. Most of the time too, what we end up seeing as you interact with Splunk is classic XML dashboards. It's the most frequent. It's the easiest one to get started building if you're going to create your own. And there's a lot of things that you kind of need to bring with you if you're going to start creating these React pages in Splunk UI. And so that kind of has if you have experience with React, great. If you don't, there's a little bit of a prerequisite that you got to do.
All right. So Alan, if Splunk UI is more complicated, how does it improve on the visualizations? How does it make it better from the other more simplistic tools that are available?
The Splunk UI toolkit provides a lot of the tools necessary to create interactive and dynamic React web applications inside of Splunk. You could use something like Classic XML or Dashboard Studio to build things, but those tools are still quite limited. Dashboard Studio is getting better and better each week, each month. I'm sure Splunk is going to add even more things this year. But Splunk UI allows you to take Dashboard Studio and really expand on it using the dashboard framework. And you can build your own components, or you can take components from open source tools, open source visualization libraries, and really add those to your application. And then you can use Splunk data on top of that. You don't need to set up another outside web application and set up your own authentication process and APIs to connect to that data. You can build that data inside of Splunk, or build that dashboard inside of Splunk, and access all of that data right away. Splunk provides you APIs to do that.
Fantastic, thank you. So Alan, let's stick with you for another moment. What are some examples of visualizations that this new capability enables?
So because the Splunk UI library is built on top of React, that's an industry standard web development library. There are plenty of open source tools out there for visualizations, for diagrams, for inputs, and anything that you really need to display data the way you need it. If you need to theme your web application in a certain way, if you need to present data in charts that just aren't there inside of Splunk Dashboard Studio or Classic XML dashboards, you can do that with Splunk UI.
Excellent. Josh, let me turn to you. What are the kinds of things that someone should take into account before they decide they're going to do a visualization through Splunk UI?
Yeah, it's a great starting point. We need to, obviously you can't do anything unless you understand the data that you're working with. So you figured out how to collect the data, you have it in Splunk. Splunk is really good at being able to collect it. You can process the data. And now it comes time to actually tell your story. What is it that you're trying to explain by showing this data off to somebody? You usually want them to take some sort of action or persuade them to invest somewhere or implement a new technology or a tool for something, especially in cybersecurity. But it all starts with understanding what it is that you actually need. If you don't really understand where you're trying to get to or the goal of what it is that you're trying to visualize, then you can't really make a good decision on whether you should be using a classic XML dashboard, a Dashboard Studio dashboard, or maybe even a full React page with fancy components. You could have the most fancy React page, But if it's not really getting your point across, then it doesn't really matter. So once you have that understanding of what it is that you're trying to do and the tools that you need to display it, you can kind of start to make a better determination of which method to go with. We mentioned before, Splunk UI is not necessarily beginner friendly. If you do have a team of savvy people that know JavaScript and TypeScript, maybe you can invest the time and the resources to have them build out something entirely that suits your needs from the bottom. But if you're just maybe a power user and you've got a bunch of other things that you got to do and you just really want to knock out this dashboard to be able to make a report or keep track of metrics, then it's very likely that Dashboard Studio or even Simple XML is going to suit those needs. So it just kind of depends on your situation.
Thank you. So Deepwatch is first and foremost a cybersecurity company. Josh, tell us a little bit about how does Deepwatch make use of this Splunk UI capability to further the activities that we perform and the capabilities we provide to our customers?
Yeah, cybersecurity, like many other industries, is one of those where the data that we have is super important. We can't really do our jobs without having data, period. But if we have bad data, then that also means that we're going to be doing our job improperly or inaccurately. And so we constantly think about the fact that we always need to be getting good data. And then from there, we can actually visualize and everything. So as an example, someone says like, hey, you've got a 0-day that your environment is vulnerable to you, it may not matter if you're not using that software or product or technology. So there's nothing for you to do. Now, once we actually have the right data so that we can visualize it, it's pretty simple. So as an example, part of what we need to do is support analysts and being able to triage alerts or look at investigations, maybe like for an incident responder, being able to understand a timeline of events that have occurred, or maybe just something as simple as looking at a process tree. Creating a process tree in Simple XML or in Dashboard Studio is I'm not even sure if we could actually even get there, but it becomes significantly easier if you're able to get over the React hurdle from Splunk UI, and you just get access to all of these other libraries and components that you can reuse, and then you basically just make it fit your use case. And our use case is cybersecurity. So if we can show you a process tree with all of the processes that were spawned, then we can kind of put together that story for the analyst or an incident responder, which ultimately goes back to the customer. We give a better explanation of the events that happened. We can give a better set of recommendations based on what it is that we're seeing. And then ultimately the customer is a lot happier because we have a lot more visibility, no pun intended, but also just context.
Thank you, Josh. So Alan, how does someone new to this deeper visualization that Splunk UI can provide, how do you get started using it?
I definitely recommend reading Splunk's documentation and look at their examples. Splunk really provides a really large amount of documentation. They also provide over a dozen examples of apps built with Splunk UI. Also had great experience working with Splunk support teams as well. If we ever had any questions about Splunk UI, they've always been there to help out. So definitely recommend using those resources.
Josh, if somebody writes a fantastic visualization and they think it's worth sharing and worth providing to the world, how do they go about doing that? How do they enrich the lives of other Splunk users around the world in the community?
So you can't just like share the component on its own, but what you could do in the easiest way is actually to package all of it up into a Splunk app, and then you can kind of publish it on Splunk base. Other people can download it, start using your visualization or component. Maybe they decide that it's good, but they need to make some small tweaks to it or something. They can then kind of take some of that and try to make those tweaks to it too. But it's definitely making a Splunk app is the way to go. There's a few more steps that are involved to kind of complete the package, because now we are talking about essentially packaging up an entire app, not just the one component that lives inside of there. But yes, if you want to be able to share with other people, or even upload it to Splunk base, we would definitely recommend going the let's create an app process and then upload it to Splunk base.
You can also package some of these visualizations inside of packages that are open sourced and allow other people to download them and use them inside of their React applications, whether that's Splunk UI or outside of Splunk as well. You don't really have to have a Splunk UI specific React component. You can use normal React components and they work great.
Thank you. So last question for the session, and Josh, I'll start with you on this one as well. Are there tools you would recommend to help jumpstart the process for people?
Splunk makes it easy to get started. They have an entire page that talks about the different terms that we've been talking about. What does dashboard framework mean? What's Splunk UI, the Splunk UI toolkit? And so they'll go and explain all of these things, so it's pretty easy to understand. But they also have links. And Alan mentioned a little bit ago the packages that can be made available. Well, Splunk does provide a few packages. As an example, the create package. That one has like a lot of the base code that you need to get the app set up, all the base code and everything. And then there's also a React UI package, and that one includes a lot of the UI elements, the components, like if you want to add a card or a button, all of that stuff is in there, and it's kind of out of the box. You can pick and choose the different pieces that you need. All of those documentation links and everything are all part of Splunk UI's kind of like base documentation. So if you were to go through there, you'd have an easy time being able to follow along. And they also have some examples that you can walk through as well. React documentation, just as a general, is probably good to know since we are building upon React, JavaScript, and TypeScript as well. So anything that you could do there, maybe just support the knowledge that you have of React as a general tool would be beneficial. And finally, the GitHub repo that we made available as part of the presentation, the theater session that we did at .conf, does have a link to a GitHub repo. On there, we kind of have what your app should look like if you're following along with Splunk's documentation. Think about it as like a shell. And this is what your app is supposed to look like. You can kind of take that if you want to use that as a starting point. You could add in your own components, visualizations, pages, whatever you need. But most of that is built directly from following the documentation that Splunk created.
And we'll share some links to some of the tools the gentleman mentioned in the blog associated with this video. So to recap, gentlemen, it turns out that buried within Splunk's capabilities today is this Splunk UI solution. It's head and shoulders above some of the other visualization solutions in terms of some of the things it can do. Things like a process map that may not be very easy to do with the other more simple tools. The problem, of course, though, is we're starting to get into the language of programming and a lot more depth required to be able to use this capability than to use some of the other capabilities that are already within Splunk for visualization. So if you're finding that you can't get the visualizations you need, you can't tell the story you need to tell through the Splunk visualizations that maybe you've been utilizing, maybe it is time to investigate Splunk UI. And these gentlemen have shared some great knowledge on how to get about doing that, along with some wonderful tools for doing so. So Alan, Josh, I'd like to thank you both for spending some time with us today on From the SOC.
Thanks, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Bill.